Hi, everybody. Welcome to the eighth consecutive anti-spy bill event from the Internet Party. I am super happy and excited because today we have someone that I've been chatting to for a number of years on Twitter. His name is Aral, and he's a pretty renowned anti-surveillance and pro-privacy activist. You would have seen and heard from him at quite a few of the major European and I'm sure American events, pro-privacy events. Aral, say hi.
Hi there, Suzie. How are you?
Tumbles. I'm good, but
I think you
I've
just
got
had
an
that moment.
unexpected
You just had
visitor.
that
I
moment.
did. Aral, tell us about your journey and how you came to where you are today and to joining us.
I started out making things with computers when I was 7 years old. My dad brought home a personal computer, an IBM XT at the time, and a basic manual. And he put those in front of me and he basically said, look, play with them. You can't break it. You can't break them. And I did. I played with the computer. I started making games. Eventually, I did break it quite spectacularly by plugging in a co-processor that wasn't meant for that motherboard. So there was sparks and fire. But that was really amazing because, back then I could just write a few lines of code and create some stars, some pixels, and a few more lines of code and create a starship, and then a few more, and I could actually fly my starship through a universe that I created. And I was 7 years old, and that's magical. But there was one thing that this computer didn't do, and that was that it didn't track my every move. It didn't store it forever. It didn't analyze it continuously to create a profile of me, which then it could exploit for its profit and political motives. And if it did any of these things, like if you put a floppy disk in, you ran an app, and it started trying to gather your data or transfer it somewhere, we knew what to call that, and we called it malware. We called it spyware, right? And we knew it was bad. Today, we would call that the business model of potentially the next billion-dollar Silicon Valley unicorn success story. So it's been a very long journey for me. I mean, I started out very hedonistically, just creating stuff for myself. Then creating things that other people began to use, and realizing that the things that we make, the new everyday things, they can have a profound impact on the experience, the lives of the people that use them. And so I really started concentrating on design. How do we make these experiences that people have delightful ones, empowering ones? And I was very naive because I thought at the time that if we design things as beautifully as possible, to be as convenient as possible, as accessible as possible, and to be as empowering as possible, that would be it. That we were actually designing things that did what they said on the tin, not realizing naively, because that's just not how I ever approached things, that you could build a beautiful, convenient, gorgeous product that wasn't a tool for people, but a trap. A trap to get them to reveal more about themselves, a trap to addict them, so that we could actually mine them and farm them for this precious data, this information about them, so that we could draw insights about them, about their behavior, so that we could exploit them, which is really the business model of mainstream technology, the business model of Silicon Valley. So it's been a very long process of increasingly becoming aware of certain things. And for me, the Snowden revelations were the last drop, where I was like, I cannot not devote myself to trying to do something about this at this point. So for the past 4 years, I've been working full time with a tiny not-for-profit that we founded, me and Laura, and it's our husky, Oscar. And we're based in Malmo now. We used to be based in the UK. And it became somewhat impossible for us to stay there and keep doing what we're doing, or would have, when the Conservatives won the second election, and they came into power with a mandate for the IP Act, which was, of course, then the IP Bill, the Investigatory Powers Bill, also known as the Snoopers Charter, which passed at the beginning of this year. and gives the UK government backdoor access to all communications channels legally. And a lot of people in the UK are not aware of this. The Labour Party just under Tom Watson's watch rolled over for a belly rub on this and just capitulated. So it makes it impossible for us to do what we're doing, because we're working to build and encourage decentralized, interoperable, zero knowledge systems, which under IP Act, are de facto illegal. Actually, they're not executing on this right now, as far as I'm aware, but they're expressing their desire to do so. Amber Rudd, for example, is all over the media saying, we got to be able to listen in on the bad guys. Well, yeah, you can't listen in on the bad guys without listening in on everyone as well. She basically wants to do away with end-to-end encryption, which of course would make everyone insecure. So basically for that reason, and of course Brexit was looming. I'm not a UK citizen, I'm a French citizen. And they also wanted to do away with the Human Rights Act, which, I mean, ask yourselves, who does that? We're humans. These are laws that protect our rights. Who actually goes out there and says we want to destroy the Human Rights Act? So anyway, because of these things, we left the UK. We're in Sweden right now. But all that to say, it's been a very, very long process of increasingly becoming aware of things that I'm not comfortable with. And you always have that, it's especially coming from a privileged background like I do. I mean, I was 7 years old and I had a computer. That's privilege. I passed as white, although my background is Turkish. My parents are Turkish. That's privilege. So when I was very young, I didn't have to think about a lot of things. I could just hedonistically enjoy technology and play with it. But increasingly becoming aware of my own privilege, increasingly becoming aware of things I don't agree with. And I think that's true for all of us. We have these moments where we have to decide, hey, here's a system. Maybe I'm benefiting from the system as well. And I never even thought about it. But now that I see that there's an element of it that I don't agree with, even if I'm benefiting from it, what do I do? Do I keep doing it because it benefits me? Or do I say, well, actually, I don't want to look away from this. I don't agree with this. Let's change this. So that's why I do what I do now. That's kind of, that's the path that's brought me to where we are now with Indie, our little not-for-profit, trying to do two things. One, regulate the abuses of this mainstream, this kind of neoliberal Silicon Valley surveillance capitalism that is the mainstream of technology, build things to regulate it technologically. So we have a tracker blocker, for example, called Better, which just basically says to companies like Google, which can currently track you across 70 to 80% of the web. The 70% statistic is from Princeton, the 80% from my own web crawls, to say to companies like that, well, you can't, we're going to stop you. You're actually physically not going to be able to track people if they have Better installed. uBlock Origin, for example, is another great example of a tracker blocker. And at the same time, trying to encourage legislation. But all of this is to regulate their abuses, to say, look, you're being abusive. This is not on. We're going to stop you. But at the same time, also encouraging the alternatives, because we can't just tell people stop using mainstream technology. That's like saying, don't use the pavements and the roads because you don't agree with how let's say they were built with slave labor and you don't agree with it, so don't use them. No, I mean, that's the infrastructure we have. Let's make sure it's a safer space. Let's make sure we regulate it, make sure it's not abusive or regulate the abuses, but let's actually build new infrastructure. Let's encourage and fund the alternatives that people can use. And we know what those alternatives have to look like. We know they have to be decentralized so that we don't have this accumulation of information and wealth, which is the key thing about surveillance capitalism, right? Surveillance and capitalism. And let's make sure they're interoperable. Let's make sure that they're free and open so we don't have to trust them. Let's make sure there's no lock-in. We know the characteristics of the alternative, so let's build those. So let's regulate the abuses and let's replace them with ethical alternatives. And that's where we are today.
Cool. Aral, I was actually just about to ask you about exactly that, which is surveillance capitalism, because I feel like we have these buzzwords and this terminology that people like you and I are very, very familiar with, but I'm not sure that the general public at large is. So when you're talking about surveillance capitalism, you're talking about the intersection between profit and spying. Is that correct?
Well, pretty much, yeah. So surveillance is about the accrual of information. Capitalism is about the accrual of wealth. So what do you get when you have these two things working in tandem with a feedback loop between them, where technology is acting as an amplifier and amplifying this ideology that is based on the accrual and concentration of wealth and power? That's surveillance capitalism. It's a term that was coined by Shoshana Zuboff, who is from the Harvard Business School. And I think it perfectly explains the socio-technical, economical system that we live in today. And what it's not is it's not compatible with fundamental freedoms, human rights. It's not compatible with democracy. We're talking about a feudal system. If you look at Oxfam statistics, for example, they track inequality in the world, and according to their numbers, based on things like statistics from the World Bank, the wealthiest 5 men in the world. I mean, this statistic does not include women. The wealthiest 5 men in the world, who are the wealthiest individuals in the world, have as much wealth as half of the world's poorest population combined today. That's 5 men having as much wealth as 3.5 billion people. So that's systemic inequality. That's what surveillance capitalism results in. And those 5 men are very familiar names. We're talking about Mark Zuckerberg. We're talking about Jeff Bezos. We're talking about Larry Ellison from Oracle. We're talking about Michael Bloomberg from Bloomberg. And who is the fifth? I keep
Must
forgetting.
be Bill Gates, right?
Bill Gates, of
Right.
course. It's Bill
And
Gates.
all 5 of those are American males, American white males.
Is this democracy? I mean, is this compatible with democracy? Is this compatible with human rights? No, it's a new feudalism. These are our new kings.
And each of those, arguably, is also an example of surveillance capitalism in terms of their businesses and their business models.
Oh yeah, the business model is people farming. That's what I call it. When you think about Google, when you think about Facebook, these are factory farms for human beings. We are the livestock that's being farmed. When I said that when they build products, it
your sound has just dropped out.
Exists.
Sorry,
can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good now.
Yeah, it was just my alarm coming on because I thought naively that I could actually sleep until 9 a.m. today. And I was, of course, awake at 6 in the morning reading something by Tim O'Reilly that just got me really frustrated because he was on Facebook. He posted something about the head of AI at Google, and how he was profoundly talking about how it's not the data, but it's the algorithmic bias that's the problem with AI. And
Who is Tim O'Reilly?
Tim O'Reilly is one of the people who really made open source, popularized open source. He's the publisher, the head of O'Reilly Press. So a very well-respected person in Silicon Valley and in the tech world, and someone that people look up to as a voice for ethics, etc. And that's what pissed me off, because he was one of my heroes in the past as well. Before I understood the difference between free software and open source, for example, having spoken with Richard Stallman, I do understand that difference now. And I see how open source came about a decade after free software as a reaction to free software, which cares about morals and ethics. And it was a reaction from the business community where they looked at free software and they said, oh, look, the source is open. And this could have, business benefits, more eyes on the code. It could be open as in open for business. It could be free as in, free labor. So we like those aspects. But Richard also wants people to protect the freedom of what they do. So we think that's quite viral. We should be able to take from the commons, but not give back, right? So that we can actually take things that people have created and shared. And if we want to invest millions and build things on top of that, but not share that. Google does this, right? Everyone thinks Google's open. Where's the GitHub repository for their search engine? Because I haven't actually seen that. They take things from the commons and then they use those to build proprietary things. So they wall off the commons. which of course leads to a tragedy of the commons. So again, this is not something I understood from the very beginning. You know, open source actually made some of the concepts accessible to me back in the day. But seeing, for example, Tim post something from the head of AI at Google and say, I mean, listen to this guy, he really knows what he's talking about. The first comment on there was like, genius. And I was like, you're legitimizing surveillance capitalism. You are the equivalent of the doctors who used to go on tobacco ads and say, this is the brand of cigarette that I smoke, right? If you look at this, the similarities, there are huge similarities between big tobacco and big data today. And big data uses the big tobacco playbook, actually. At the very beginning, you know, it was socially acceptable. Doctors were on tobacco ads. At the very beginning, nobody had any qualms about Google. Oh, look at their cute doodles. They exist to help us. They're so lovely. And then when people started catching on, when policymakers started catching on in both instances, they started lobbying heavily. If you look at the European Commission, Google is the #1 lobbyer of the European Commission now. A couple of years ago, they didn't lobby at all. So, you know, they're using the same playbook. And there's going to come a time when we're going to look back and we're going to say, wow, look at these people who said that they cared about ethics and technology and they were supporting Google and they were legitimizing them. They're like those doctors. They're like those doctors in those tobacco ads. So that's what got me riled up at 6 a.m. And then we had our conversation, of course, about Google in schools, which, gosh, do you want to talk about that, Suzie? Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So now what we're seeing is that Google is insidiously spreading itself into every area and facet of human existence. So it was bad enough when they mapped everybody's houses on the planet, you know, for Google Maps and used our Wi-Fi to do it. Now I've discovered in the last few weeks exactly how far they've expanded their empire, their surveillance empire. So when we talk about Google, the key thing to remember is that Google servers are all backdoored by NSA. The spy agencies have the ability to access any of that data at any time at whim. So Google is really the government. WikiLeaks put out an amazing book specifically about Google's ties to the State Department and to the US government, showing very clearly the high-level relationships between the company and the government as well. So this is something Julian Assange has talked about for a number of years. Google now has expanded to create products, web services and products for your home through which has spawned these companies, these software development companies, which create these products and services specifically to integrate with Google and Google's platform. We would call them plugins. They're essentially because they plug into the existing Google infrastructure. So we have now companies like Nest, which you would have seen me tweeting about today. And actually probably Aral's better to talk about Nest, and we'll get there in a minute. But what Nest is doing is bringing, one of the things they're doing is bringing facial recognition technology into your house. So your camera at your front door to see who's there is now networked surveillance. It's not just a local closed circuit, it's a CCTV, which is similar to previously in the anti-spy bill events, we've been discussing the civic surveillance infrastructure, where they have facial recognition technology that is also based on these networked camera systems, network surveillance systems. And we've discussed how they're networked across borders. So now the cameras in the streets of Auckland City, where I'm from, can be viewed by someone sitting at a data center in Washington, DC. Well, what Nest is doing with their Google Home plugins is making it so that your surveillance cameras in your house are also accessible by someone sitting in a data center in Washington, DC. And by integrating facial recognition technology with it, it means that you are now literally reporting on your guests and your visitors to the government. In 30 years' time, your government will be able to know who was at your doorstep on X date in 2017. They will be able to collect facial recognition profiles of people who have visited your house. They will be able to map people's faces based on them having visited your house. And interestingly, I went and looked at the promotional videos, which show the use cases for this technology. And it shows a guy brushing his teeth in his bathroom when his doorbell rings. So instead of washing his damn mouth out and going and answering his door, instead he turns on his mobile phone, which of course he has with him as he brushes his teeth, and looks at, like, gets a facial recognition match for the person standing at his doorstep to save himself 1 minute of brushing his teeth. This is the kind of ridiculous way that they promote this. They promote it as making your life easier because now you won't have to interrupt yourself brushing your teeth. But what they're actually doing is getting you to do the spy's job for them. And this is something I have to wonder if, like, the NSA employees and the spy agency employees really understand, is that the direction that this is going in, when you couple automation and you couple these surveillance networks, you know, now including your home and your house, if they understand that really they will be replaced, and this is where it's going in the long term. So then we have Google Classroom, and this is something that we discussed in last week's anti-spy bill event, which is that if you're familiar with the hacking team disclosures and with the various surveillance products which have been used to target activists and journalists for years now, which are available in the private sector and also to all of the governments, it's remote access technology. It's essentially a form of malware that is implanted into your devices, which then allows other people, third parties, to view your use of the device and to track and report on your use of the device in real time. That technology, which was originally, we were told, was for terrorists. We were told it was for counterterrorism purposes. Then, sure enough, was used against dissidents and journalists and whoever else that suited them to target. But now is by default being used against children in classrooms in schools. So there's a piece of software by a company called Hutt, which originated in New Zealand. The company's still in New Zealand, but it's also now in Silicon Valley, and it's been invested in directly by Google. It is a plugin for a product called Google Classroom. Google Classroom is a suite of products designed for use by academics and by students. For example, Gmail and just all of the Google products together and you know, the G+ suite as we know of it. So what they have is they are teaching children to use Google products, giving them access to Google products. Then they've created this interface for the teachers, which allows real-time access to the students' computers 24/7. It also reports on every keystroke, every activity of the child 24/7. So all of their communications, all their email communications, all of their assignments, classwork, everything they type, everything they look at in a web browser, everything they read or research, all of their areas of interest. It integrates with Google Calendar. So now you know what time and what day they were at what sports or extracurricular activity. And the configuration for the software requires, before they even use it, for the teachers to upload all of the school enrollment data directly into the Google Cloud. So this means now they don't just know what every student is doing every day, they know who's sitting next to them and who's in the class on the other side of the wall. They can map their entire social network, not just social network in terms of social media use, but their real world social network, who their friends are, what other kids are also on their sports team, which they now know from the Google Calendar because they can track through the events, who was where, when, who they were talking with, what they were talking about. Then you add in the factor that we already know that the microphones and the camera devices can be turned on and remotely accessed on all of the devices that the students have. And literally their entire life is not only accessible in real time, but is stored. The data is stored forevermore. So that you not only in 30 years' time can they go back and say, oh, you were at that soccer match or this person was on your doorstep, but they can also listen to the conversation that you're having next to your laptop that was sitting on the desk that the teacher could also access. And we have not even begun.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm just saying, and if you think about the fact that governments are already looking into profiling children to see if they're being so-called radicalized in schools.
Exactly. You know how we all had the
Wow.
one teacher who was like really socially conscious and actually would tell us like the real history of the world, you know, when everyone else wouldn't.
Yeah.
Well, now
Yeah.
that teacher's
Yeah.
being recorded, and now they'll know
Wow.
which teacher it is that's giving the information that is non-curriculum information to the students. But the thing that I'm extremely concerned about the surveillance side of it, and I'm extremely concerned about the perennial nature of this. This can be done to the student in their home after school. It can be done during school hours. It's happening to them 7 days a week. But I'm really, really also concerned about what are the opportunities for abuse. So what happens the first time that you get a malicious teacher that targets a student for whatever reason? You know, it's just obvious to me that it's rife for abuse, this technology.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what we're doing is we're normalizing surveillance, right? I actually was involved very, very intimately with one of the first so-called coding initiatives for children, because having learned how to program as a kid, I know that that can spark a lifetime of enthusiasm for this. So in the UK, two friends of mine, Claire and Linda, were setting up Code Club, and I was trying to be as supportive as possible. I joined their board of directors as well. And at the moment Code Club started picking up steam and started getting sponsors, of course, Google wanted to sponsor. And both myself and Linda, the co-founder, and me on the board, we were vehemently opposed to this, of course, because we didn't want to contribute to legitimizing surveillance for the next generation. It's like, you know, saying, taking McDonald's meals and saying, this is a nutritious meal, have it in your cafeteria. You know, and when I first made that analogy, I think it was on Twitter, I said, you know, and we don't do that. And someone from the US said, actually, we do. So, I mean, the world is pretty screwed up. But so both of us were like, no, I mean, this is not good. And we were forced out, basically. I mean, I resigned and Linda resigned. 3 years on now, we're seeing with like New America, I think, Foundation in the US, where someone criticized or actually applauded the antitrust ruling that was passed in Europe against Google, and then they were, made redundant. And because when we left, there was a couple of media articles on it that we left because of this reason. But people were like, "Oh no, Google doesn't have any soft power in that way. They don't know." I mean, Google never went to Code Club and said, "Hey, shut these people up." They said, "Here's some money." The people at Code Club kind of were like, well, I mean, if they don't shut up, we might not get that money, I guess, even if they didn't have to say anything. They have such power because they can just, they can sponsor things. And if we allow them to sponsor things, then we're legitimizing them. There are privacy conferences like CPDP, Computers and Privacy and whatever. It has privacy in the name. There was like Amsterdam Privacy Week. And these were sponsored by Google, Facebook. One of them was sponsored by Palantir. I mean, you're saying you care about privacy. This is not a neutral conference. I mean, if it's web something, okay, be sponsored by whatever. That is the web. The web is Google, Facebook. I mean, it's a monopoly. It's these new mainframes, mainframe 2.0. But if you're if you say you care about privacy, or if you're an educational institution and you're being sponsored by, or you're using Google products, what you're doing is you're normalizing surveillance. You're normalizing surveillance capitalism, and you are actively pushing back our efforts to make Google and Facebook socially unacceptable, just like we did with tobacco, with big tobacco, because that's the only time we're going to start to win this. When Google and Facebook and their toxic business model that's based on exploiting this exploitative business model, when that becomes socially unacceptable, when the best graduates from whatever university, don't say, oh, I wish I could work at Google, but instead, kind of like Philip Morris, that's never anyone's first choice to work there. They're kind of like, I don't think I want to work at Google. In fact, I was talking to Eric Schmidt a few years back in London at a cocktail party of some sort after he was releasing his new book with Jared Cohen, his co-author. And I asked him, because he was talking about how governments shouldn't have our data. And of course, you know, when you think about these companies, data is their assets, because it's not your data, it's their data. So of course they're in a battle with governments. It's kind of good cop, bad cop. And they're like, oh no, we got to protect people's assets, people's data, but they're really protecting their assets. So I asked him, why should you have this data? You know, so, and he basically said, if we ever get too evil, we won't find anyone to work for us. And that's one of the things that's really stayed with me, because I thought it was very naive at the time. I was like, Monsanto finds people to work for them. You know, Lockheed Martin has people working for them. You know, the worst corporations have people working for them just for money. But I realized later what he really meant. He was actually being quite honest. He actually meant the best of the best, which is what Google needs to be Google, right? And also, as they become more socially unacceptable, and it becomes clear, you know, how they're exploiting people, then it becomes easier to regulate them as well. So yeah, it's what we're doing really is we're normalizing surveillance, and we're legitimizing surveillance, and we have to stop doing that. Because like Bruce Schneier said, and you touched upon it, you know, there isn't this separation between corporations and governments. Even if only the corporations themselves had them. I mean, some of these corporations are more powerful than certain governments, right? So that in and of itself is not a good thing.
They fund these politicians. Effectively, they fund
governments, exactly. It's called institutional corruption, right? Lawrence Lessig in the US was actually running for president at some point last year on this one issue because he thinks it's so important. And we're not talking about a dumb guy here. You know, he's like the founder of Creative Commons. He's a lawyer. And he was running on this one issue because unless we can remove the influence of corporate finance in public policymaking, this corrupting influence of this amazing amount of monetary power these corporations have. I'm talking about lobbying here. I'm talking about revolving doors. Unless we can remove these corrupting influences, then we can't regulate them because they're effectively writing the regulations by proxy. The people who should be regulating them and protecting us in the European Commission, for example, 2 years later can go and work at these corporations and do. This is an institutionally corrupt system. So we got to really fight institutional corruption so that we can regulate. But at the same time, we need imagination. We need a counter narrative to Silicon Valley, a compelling counter narrative to actually fund and create the decentralized, interoperable, free and open tools. That's where we really need to concentrate our efforts and how we get that to happen. So yeah, there's a lot to be done. You there, Suzie?
I'm here, yeah. I have some
I saw your
unwelcome visitors, but I'm here.
It's okay. Turn on your video. We'll say hi. I'll let you handle that situation there. I have a wall behind me, so I'm perfectly okay. I'm
lucky you.
But that happened, didn't it? That was like a big thing that happened to a journalist who was, or someone who was on a news program, and it was just a few weeks ago or a few months ago, and the door opened, and his wife, I think, ran in after the child.
No,
do you remember this? Did you see this?
It's a pretty common occurrence in my life.
Thing for like 2 days.
It usually only happens in my business meetings. I've usually got my shit together a bit better for the live streams, but
you know what? So what? So what? We're all human. We have families. We're like, this is part of the issue. You know, where the mainstream especially is so focused on formalism, on how things look, on things looking perfect. I mean, this is what neoliberalism is all about, right? They get up there and they say all the right things. They look good. But they're supporting the inherent structural inequalities. So let's go beyond formalism. Who cares if your kid walks in? You
won't have to look very far to find videos of me with no makeup on YouTube. I'm pretty pro. In fact, I did a 1-hour interview with H.A. Goodman with a puke bucket next to me because I had a gastro bug, and I'm like covered in sweat and like looking like I'm about to die on the camera, but I was so determined to do the slot that I sat there and did it. For me, I mean, I'm happy to talk about this. So the issue for me is that I'm a single mom. And my kids have been targeted in the past because of my activism. So,
Right. Okay. And that makes sense.
So in New Zealand, literally, there were like private investigators being hired to harass me, and then they were they published like my home address and photos of my car and house all over Facebook with references to my then 7-year-old daughter being present at the house. So I felt like for the protection of my kids that I need to keep them very, very separate from my activism. And
that makes perfect
so
sense.
I mean, it's sad because it shouldn't be that way, but I also feel that I have a responsibility not to involve them in what I do for their own protection.
Yeah, you're right. And I think before that, what I was to segue back, what I was trying to say was, Bruce Schneier said this very clearly. It's been a while now, where he said, governments didn't just wake up and say, we want all this data. They looked up and they said, hey, the corporations have all this data. Why don't we get ourselves a copy? I love that quote from him, because as long as we have these centers, as long as we have these silos where all of this information, this insight is being gathered, refined, etc. These are the Googles, Facebooks. This is the mainstream business model. Then we're creating these convenient drive-through fast food outlets, where our governments can kind of say, okay, yeah, I'll have 2 copies of that and maybe 10 of these, and these are intertwined. I mean, Eric Schmidt leads a board initiative at the Pentagon, and I think Jeff Bezos is on it by his invitation, etc. And again, these are people who, like, if you talk about Eric, he's got over $1 billion in probably what is disposable income, and that's a lot of power. He's involved with the Pentagon. He's heading Alphabet Incorporated. You've got Jeff Bezos there. There was this photo, I don't know if you've seen it, that just sums up surveillance capitalism for me. This photo of the leaders of all of the major tech companies in the world, who among themselves have more intimate information about more people than anyone has ever had in the history of mankind. This photo where they're sitting at the same table as then President-elect Donald Trump. I mean, if you've seen this photo and that doesn't scare the shit out of you, I don't know what will. I mean, because it does for me. And you also see the hypocrisies in the system, because a lot of people started becoming afraid of this stuff when Trump got into power. But they were perfectly fine when Obama was in power and we had created this surveillance state because Obama's cool, right? I mean, he shoots hoops, he's awesome, he talks well, he says all the right things in terms of, what if you're a neoliberal, you want to feel good about yourself. He says those things. But again, the system wasn't built in a day when Trump was elected. It was built, we're talking about 20, 30 years of neoliberalism that's created the core inequalities that we're experiencing, and maybe a decade of surveillance capitalism. So, yeah.
You're completely right too. The way that you talk about them, that's what they're doing. They're co-opting your events and your organizations. They are using money primarily to do so. But this is something, and also the self-regulation that you were just talking about a moment ago.
Self-regulation, that's absolute bullshit.
It's in every industry though. So like for one of my articles, I was researching the New Zealand Press Council, because in New Zealand, we have this system where if newspaper or magazines write some nonsense about you, you should go to court and sue them. But instead, they have this press council. And if you complain, you're encouraged to complain to the press council. Like every publisher will tell you, well, file a complaint with the press council. What most people don't realize is if they do file a complaint with the press council, they are waiving their rights to sue. And
so it's arbitration.
Correct. But then secondarily, I went back through all the findings of the press council. I went back through about 200 decisions, and I couldn't there was like one decision where they had upheld the complaint, even though some of the complaints were like violations of privacy of children, like really serious like complaints that are abundantly obvious that they have merit, and they'd found against the complainant over and over and over again. So I thought to myself, well, who's on this press council? So I went and had a look through, and sure enough, it's people who have established relationships with the exact same media outlets who people are complaining against that are staffing this press council. So it's not like independent experts or like some, public service people. It is, in fact, people with lifelong media careers and established media relationships with the same organizations who they're then involved in policing. Yeah. So sure enough, they're just finding in favor of the media organization over and over again. And I know, too, that this is the issue that with the World Bank, also with the World Trade Organization. But the World Bank, if you go and look at who is involved in the World Bank, which, of course, was regulating financial industry around the world, you find it is the heads of the big banks.
I mean, when I say institutional corruption, this is what I'm talking about. It's the influence of money. It is the kind of this system, that we have. It is inherently corrupt, and that's what we have to tackle.
And money is the corrupting force, right? Because how many people would work at Google if Google didn't pay them?
Well, see, that's the thing. A lot of people work at Google, and people that I know who went into working at Google kind of naively, I think, like I was approaching things, because Google lies to their employees as well. Google doesn't tell their employees, exactly. They don't tell their employees, hey, welcome to the factory farm. Do you want to see the livestock? And today you'll be working on this piece of farming machinery to extract this information from them. They're like, you're making the world better. You're connecting people. Look at all the features that we're creating. Just like they say to the people who are using them, look at the features, look at the cute doodles. Don't look at what's behind the curtain. That's don't worry about those screams that are coming out from there. That's nothing. And they do this to their employees as well, which is it's interesting, because I've been talking about this stuff for a while. And an ex-Google employee on Twitter at one point tweeted something like, I don't know how Aral knows this stuff, because I know he'd never worked there or whatever, but he doesn't even I think he doesn't understand the level at which this happens. And he basically said that they have what they call edge orientations, which is something that apparently Scientology also has, where you're told certain things, but then if you want to graduate to the next level, or you need to have some knowledge in order to, because the people at the top know what they're doing, right? They apparently have things that they call, according to this person, this ex-Google employee, they call them edge orientations, where they let them in on a bit more of it, if they're using cult techniques, there's a problem here. And it's what do we expect? What do we expect?
That's the same thing. The pharmaceutical companies tell their employees that they're saving lives, right? They're saving millions of lives in sub-Saharan Africa or wherever.
Yeah. And the worst thing is, sorry to cut you off, the worst thing is, they could, not Google, not the way that they're funded, and they are what they are. They're never going to be reformed. You can't reform that. You can't take a factory farm and make it into an animal sanctuary. So they're not making mistakes or anything. This is structural. But we can, with technology, actually do the things and actually just have things that do what they say they are. Actually just build tools that empower people, that make their lives better. This is what frustrates me the most. I lived through this era, in the personal computer era, which was the last era in which we had decentralized technologies where we owned and controlled our machines. Our machines worked for us. They were our tools. They only existed to empower us. So it's possible, right?
I'm grinning my face off, because this is exactly the lecture that I've been giving in previous weeks. So I've been talking about how we used to be our own systems administrator. We used to be our own data administrator. How we used to purchase, like from our ISP, we would get our own little piece of the internet, and we would have our home pages, and we'd decide what to put on our home pages and who to give the access to the home page, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, how there was no centralized systems, and how that gave us the freedom to decide what we really wanted to be out there about us. There was no like structured database for us to enter our information into, which then allows it to be analyzed, queried on alongside everybody else's information. It was very, very decentralized and very disparate, and it worked. It was great.
Well, if you look at it historically, I mean, I was talking about the personal computing era, which is the era I was essentially born into. But before that, we had the first era of computing, which was centralized. And we're talking about mainframe computers. These were large machines that were owned by wealthy institutions, either universities or corporations, but their area of effect was limited pretty much to those institutions. But the people who worked there, I mean, there were other people's machines, they had to rent time on them, but it was limited in scope. And then we got the personal computing era where we decentralized that and people began to own their own machines. But then the next era, we went back to the future in a way with the web, not so much the internet, but the web, where we started the next era of centralized technology, because we think of the web as decentralized, but it's not, it's centralized. When you take a client server architecture and you put it into an enzymatic vat, a pool of venture capital, which incentivizes these centers, these servers to grow and scale vertically. And as they grow, of course, they coalesce with all of the companies buying each other, the mergers that are happening. They coalesce and they grow and they become these huge centers, these new mainframes. Our new mainframes in the web era, which I call mainframe 2.0, are the Googles, are the Facebooks. Apparently there was someone at IBM during the mainframe era who famously said that the world would just have 5 mainframe computers at some point, and people laughed at him during the personal computing era. He just missed the generation, really. There are about only 5 mainframe computers in the world today, and they're Google, they're Facebook, they're Amazon, etc. So we live now again in a centralized era where we're using other people's machines. The difference is that the scope is global now. They're not limited to various organizations. Now it affects every facet of our lives. We're talking about smart things, right? Your smart television, your smart teddy bear, your smart watch, your smart car, smart cities. I mean, who's getting smarter about whom? That's the question we should be asking, because we can build technologies where we're getting smarter about ourselves, even the things that are the scare, quotes like facial recognition. There's absolutely nothing wrong with facial recognition if I'm the only one who's able to access the facial recognition data for myself. So for example, how Apple's implemented the Face ID feature, which stays on the secure enclave, on the phone, not accessible to anyone else, helps me unlock my phone. I'm kind of okay with that. I'd be far more okay with it if it was free and open source and I could actually verify certain things. But that's me getting smarter about myself. That's me having a tool for myself. Now, if the same thing were implemented by Google, that information would be going out to Google. And that's Google getting smarter about me. Smart cities, are we getting smarter about us, or is the city getting smarter about us, the government getting smarter about us? Now that's dangerous, right? Technology, in the words of Melvin Kranzberg, is neither good nor bad, and essentially nor is it neutral. And that's the key thing, right? We can build technologies that empower us if we own and control them as individuals. That's the key test here. If we do not own and control them, if corporations own and control them, and then by extension, they're made available to governments, then we're talking about a very different type of social system. We're talking about a corporatocracy that we're living in, an autocracy, a feudalistic system. And that's what we're living in right now. This is not some dystopic vision of the future that we're sleepwalking into if we're not careful. We're there now. The only question we need to answer.
We're already beyond. We're beyond Orwell's vision. Definitely.
So the question really is, how do we chart a different path forward? I believe we can. I don't think I'm being idealistic here. I think I'm just being realistic with an imagination. I think we can. But that is what we have to explore at this point. How do we limit their abuses You know, how do we regulate them? And then how do we replace them with the path that we want to go on, the future we want to have?
So I think
and that is an internet of people. That's what I see, because that's what you were saying. You know, we all had our own place on the internet. That is exactly what I call an internet of people. And I have a lot of hope, because there's some initiatives in Europe, especially, where, you know, we have a chance right now to start creating an internet of people.
I think what we call waking people up requires them being able to see through the marketing dribble that is sold to them in order to get them to buy into these systems and these products. So on the classroom side of it, the privacy waiver that's being sent home to the children's parents is telling them this is about better learning opportunities for your child. Your child will have access to better things and will have a stronger educational backbone from allowing the government to have perennial access to every single facet of their entire lives. You know, in terms of the Hapara software, when we looked at it, it's all about openness. And as you said before, open is like a scary word now. It's like a really scary word.
Well, I mean, look, human beings have a basic fundamental human right to privacy. Transparency and openness, those are for corporations and those are for governments. So governments should be as transparent as possible, should be as open as possible, so we know what they're doing, because they're powerful. A government can deprive you of your freedom, can deprive you of your life in certain places. Corporations have a huge amount of economic power. We are, as individuals, powerless in this system. That's why we need privacy, to try and tip those scales, to at least try to balance those scales a little bit. But we live in a world that's topsy-turvy, where we have no privacy. We're increasingly being told that privacy is dead by people like Mark Zuckerberg, who, when they buy a house, buy the 4 houses around them, because their privacy is alive and well. Thank you very much.
And covers his cameras with stickers.
Exactly, right? Yeah, because his privacy isn't dead. He's talking about your privacy, you know, when he says that. But you know, at the same time, we need to like turn this system upside down, because it's topsy-turvy. You know, the people, the individuals who have a right to privacy, don't have it. And corporations and governments, which should be as transparent as possible, are opaque. You know, Nest, like you said, owned by Google, we buy their cameras and we put them into our own homes. I mean, like the Stasi were amateurs, right? They actually have to crawl in through your window. Google's like, that's not how we do it in surveillance capitalism. You buy that shit. So we buy their cameras, we put them into our homes, because they lie to us. You know, they don't tell you exactly what they're going to do with that, right? Or they don't put the focus on that. And if I was to take a camera, however, and walk into Google Incorporated or Alphabet's offices, I'd be arrested. And that should be the other way around, right? We have a right to privacy, which we don't have today. Corporations and governments don't have a right to privacy. They should be as open and transparent as possible, and they have that right today. And then we're wondering, why is everything screwed up? Well, you know, that's what systemic inequality does, though.
The other thing is that
inequality
they sell this all about how it's going to fight crime and whatnot. Like on the Nest thing, they show this example. One of the use cases is some random guy's going to steal a package off, you know, from your doorstep. And if you install this device, it will stop your package getting stolen. But what it won't stop is, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of arms deals that's fueling war around the world, or the money launderers that are laundering billions of dollars to make those arms deals happen. There's not a damn thing about any of this surveillance capitalism that's going to stop that.
No. I mean, they're not even trying to do that, right? I mean, Saudi Arabia are our allies, right? Cool.
Not just our allies, but they're actually on the Human Rights Council.
They are indeed. And if you saw the news recently, the U.S. actually was one of the few countries that didn't sign onto a declaration condemning the death penalty for people who are homosexual. So yeah, no, I mean, we don't have in the West so-called a moral or ethical leg to stand on any issue. At this point, I would like us to in the future, hopefully, but that's going to require a very different path forward. Because really, like I was saying earlier, this is the major symptom of systemic inequality. Systemic inequality inverts justice. If you don't understand why the world is as it is, if everything seems upside down, it's because it is. There's nothing wrong with you. It's the world. It's the world we created.
If you saw that movie Wall-E too, you'd see that one corporation owned everything. You haven't seen Wall-E? It's like WALL-E. It's worth seeing. It's
Wall-E, like the robot. Yeah.
Wall-E the robot.
Sorry.
Okay.
I just thought that was like a second film about the whale, but that's
no,
really, isn't it?
No. But in Wall-E, one corporation ends up buying and owning every single thing.
But that's what we're going for. They're not even hiding this.
Exactly. And that's what I mean. Like when you have Google Earth and Google Home and Google Classroom and Google, like eventually we're just going to, like everything we buy will be from Google.
But and that's Google's business model.
Of course.
They want to digitize the world, and they want to digitize everyone in the world, and they want to own that digital copy. It's a new slavery. In slavery 1.0, we owned people's bodies and everything else that came with that. Today, the business model of Silicon Valley is to own everything else about you that makes you who you are, apart from your physical body. They don't need to entrap your physical body in some sort of dungeon somewhere, because if I have a proxy of you, if I have a digital proxy of you, and that's what a profile is, it's this living, breathing thing where I'm constantly analyzing you, constantly psychoanalyzing you, trying to build a simulation of you, a proxy, a digital copy that I own, that then I exploit. If I have that and it's high enough fidelity, then I have a proxy for exploiting your behavior. If it's low fidelity, that's also dangerous because I might think you're a terrorist when you're not, right? So there's no good outcome from this. And by the way, just so you know, my AirPods just made that noise where they're running out of juice. My phone is running out of juice. And I'm on 4G and my data is probably running out. So at some point, if I go blank, no conspiracy theories, I've run out of battery. Okay, and that might be how I leave this, just so you know.
Okay. Well, I was hoping that I would get to introduce you to Steve, who's just joined. Steve is the lead developer. Steve is the lead developer and the architect for the Pursuance project, which is Barrett Brown's vision that he created years back, which he had to wait to get out of jail to be able to realize, and is now working full time on. Steve, are you with us? You want to say hi?
I am. Hello, everybody. How are you?
Hey Steve. Welcome.
Steve, this is Aral. If you're not aware of his work, Aral is a really amazing, incredible privacy and anti-surveillance activist who I think also be pretty interested in what you're doing. We had Barrett Brown visit us in our first episode of the Anti-Spy Bill, and he talked a bit about pursuance, but it would be really great to have you describe to us exactly what it is and what you've been working on and where it's at.
Sure. Perfect. Thank you. So Pursuance is a project, as you said, created by the formerly imprisoned activist and journalist Barrett Brown. The goal of Pursuance is to sort of amplify the efforts of activists, journalists, and nonprofits. And activists in particular have been sort of flocking to this just because of Barrett's background. I mean, he went sort of head to head with, FBI and the DOJ, and he was, he provided such sort of important resistance to some of the things that are happening that he was politically targeted and spent about 5 years in jail. He was sentenced to 63 months in prison. Originally, he was facing up to 105 years in prison under the theory that if you copy and paste a link from one chat room to another chat room, then if it turns out that somebody has hacked information that you're linking to, then apparently in the US at least, the authorities will pretend that your goal was to like illegally use this information. In this case, there was credit card information that someone had hacked and like dumped onto the internet along with a bunch of documents. So Barrett's looking for documents. He was doing these sort of crowdsourced investigative journalism. But even though you can see in the chat that he's like, oh, I didn't know what was that I just linked to, whatever. He was facing up to 105 years. So he got 5 years. He's out now. He got out like November 28th, I think. And then last week of March, I was reading in Wired magazine that Barrett Brown's out of jail. He has this exciting vision for this end-to-end encrypted environment where activists, journalists, and nonprofits can kind of be amplified. So trying to do kind of what Barrett was doing before he was in jail, just kind of on steroids and with this kind of energetic ecosystem of people who are working toward achieving various largely political ends. So the ability to have, like you create a pursuance, which is like a sort of organization, and the ability to say kind of, here's what the mission is, here's here's different strategies that we have that we're employing to accomplish that mission, and being able to kind of assign different tasks to different people based on their skill set or based on who you think would be good at what. So you can have this more complex kind of coordination than was possible just a few years ago. So, I mean, Barrett said that he and Anonymous and some other people around 2012, 2011, they were trying to do kind of political, political opposition, and they had like one big chat room, and they had a wiki, and that's it. And Barrett is actually writing a book right now detailing kind of what some of the successful operations were, and saying that, okay, with no tooling and it being very, very haphazard, he saw that they were still able to achieve some pretty impressive things. So one example being like the Australian government a few years ago was trying to pass this bill to censor the internet and whatnot. So Anonymous and Barrett and whatnot successfully pushed back against that. So Barrett saw that, like, wow, you just have this kind of room of random people, and but because of the internet and because you can kind of pool talent from anywhere on the planet for the first time in human history thanks to the internet, but we're not really taking full advantage of that. So being able to have these tools, have the pursuance system where you can invite people to an end-to-end encrypted environment, and you can have like fine-grained separation of like who's doing what, to collaborate in a really powerful way over the internet, which is inevitable that will occur, and in a significant way, and that's what we're trying to achieve.
That sounds really awesome. I was involved. Well, I am involved with a pan-European political movement called DM25, which you might have heard. Founded by Yanis Varoufakis, the ex-finance minister of Greece. And I know that internally, one of the things that we're constantly debating is how do we internally as well do democracy better? How do we do governance better? And it sounds like this would be a very useful tool for movements like that to evaluate at the very least. And that it's end-to-end encrypted. That's excellent. I had a brief look when Suzie mentioned that you were doing this. It's free and open source, as I understand it, and it's end-to-end encrypted. So that's awesome. That's very cool. Sounds like you're working on something very valuable there.
Thanks. Yeah, we're very excited, and Barrett. A lot of people are excited to see what Barrett's up to. So he's been doing the rounds as far as interviews go. He was talking with IP&Z a couple weeks ago. So yeah, there's people who are stoked. We're about to pass 1,000 people on the mailing list, just working on it for a couple of months. And I mean, Barrett started a Twitter account, and after like 4 days, he had like 2,000 people following him.
Cool.
So yeah.
Is he on Mastodon as well?
I don't think so. I know. So speaking of that, actually, so initially Pursuance, so just like with like WordPress, you can like install it on your own server or someone else hosts it for you. That's a lot of how Pursuance will operate. And later we will add federation. So it'll be more, more like Mastodon in that sense, which, so for people who don't know, Mastodon is basically decentralized Twitter, more or less.
Yeah.
So kind of micro-blogging. So yeah, so we will, that will come, but we're trying to kind of nail the core initial features of, you get invited to a Pursuance. Can you understand what's happening? Can you get stuff done? Can you exchange files? Can you, really have some impact?
And that's awesome to hear, because, a lot of the challenges we have, especially in the free and open source world, is that we don't understand design for the most part, or we don't think it's important. Or actually we design things that work very well for ourselves as enthusiasts, but not necessarily for others. And that's where Mastodon really was, that's why Mastodon was so successful. It wasn't the first Twitter, decentralized or federated Twitter. It's based on O status, so there was GNU Social, etc. But why didn't any of those catch on beyond a certain community? So we really have to understand the importance of design. We have a huge advantage on the mainstream, because if you look at companies like Google and Facebook, they create very convenient, usable products, even though they have two audiences that they have to satisfy with conflicting goals. You know, they have their users, so-called, as they call them. Of course, we have only two industries that use that term. It's Silicon Valley and drug dealers. But they have their users, you know, who they track and they farm and all of this. And then their customers who actually pay them, that they monetize them with. And designing a product that meets the needs of two disparate groups like that is actually very hard. They work very hard at that. And it involves a lot of misdirection and decoration. It's not really design, it's decoration, you know, because if people could see the core, the unethical core of that, they would reject the product. So you have to make it palatable. And that's where UX comes in, etc. But we have this amazing advantage that we don't usually use, which is that we design for one audience. You only have one audience. You're creating a tool that does what it says for one audience. So if with your focus on design, which you seem to have there, I mean, that's an amazing advantage that we have as well. So that gives me a lot of hope. I'm really glad. I'd love to take a look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great point. I do care very much about design. I'm not a designer myself, but like developer and kind of project management kind of stuff. I give a talk at DEF CON 2 years ago. You know, the hacker conference, the world's largest underground hacker conference is what they call it. So yeah.
I'd argue you are a designer. I think in that role you are a designer, and I think that's one thing we really have to understand. You know, every decision that we make, and I'm assuming you make a lot of decisions in building this product, is design. It's part of it. From the structure of your database tables, if you have them, all the way up. You know, it's not the aesthetics. The real key questions and the design issues are the ones that you were talking about. The focus, the simplicity. So it sounds like you guys are really on the right track there.
For sure, yeah, and then of course, you know, design inspiration from Google products, from Slack, from, you know, different things that really nail, you know, like certain things. So like we've designed like a pretty sophisticated kind of permissions system for pursuance. Now, most people will not have to deal with that complexity, importantly, you know, but if you're sort of an admin and you're like, okay, I'm going to invite this person, how much do I trust them? Do I want them to be able to see everything? Do I want them to be able to like only see the stuff that I've assigned to them? And then if it works out, then they can kind of graduate. If someone's your best friend, you want to give them full, you know, equal control to what you have. So
Right.
So being able to kind of figure that out, where it's like, okay, so when you're like sharing something with somebody or you're like inviting someone, what permissions do they have? Someone was like, I like how Google Drive does it, you know, or how Google Docs does it. That's really simple, really powerful. It's like, okay, so we've taken, you know, inspiration directly from that. So we can have Google use its $20 billion a quarter that it makes from extracting as much information as it can about us, and take those design insights and try to extract them and apply them to open source to improve people's lives.
And also, I mean, there's a real opportunity here to start from first principles as well, because of course, remember that when Google so-called designs or decorates things, as I call them, they're building farming machinery to farm people with. Some of that may apply, of course, because they also have to, you know, create the illusion that this is a tool for you. Some of that may very well apply, but there are probably things that, because our core desire is different, we're building tools for people, not tools to farm people. Going back to first principles sometimes means that you can really come up with things that Google can't do, that we can do better, because we don't have the same limitations that Google has as well. But it's really great to see you guys just concentrating on design, understanding that importance. In free and open source, a lot of times we're so concerned with the seams, of having the seams, that we don't have a convenient, seamless experience to begin with. Whereas what we can do is we can have that beautiful initial experience, the onboarding, getting people on board, getting them to understand and use it, like all the things you said. And then we can layer the seams, which is what I think you're talking about. You know, if you need more control, okay, it's layered, you can get to that.
Right.
So it's great. It sounds like you guys are really on the right track there. And like I said, I would love to try it out. It might be very useful for movements like DM as well.
For sure, yeah. So as far as progress and kind of updates and whatnot that you and Suzie have sort of asked about or alluded to, so on November 4th, Barrett and I will be giving a very important talk. I'll be sort of interviewing him for Aaron Swartz Day. So that's November 4th and 5th. So 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. My time, Pacific time. We'll be kind of going into kind of the background of pursuance and Barrett's background and how he, you know, kind of got to coming up with these ideas that have become pursuance. And then go into a demo and say, okay, now that we understand kind of the backstory and why it's important to have a tool like this to amplify the efforts of people who are trying to change the world, basically, what does that look like? So we'll do a demo, and we're working on it now. I actually host privacy hackathons every Saturday here at a hackerspace called Noisebridge, where I am right now, and we've been working on pursuance. It was initially started off as kind of whatever privacy enhancing stuff that is important. That's what we should build. And I started a few months before I met Barrett, but now it's like most of us are working on pursuance, which is awesome. And we were building it out today.
Cool, very cool.
All right, any Q&A questions, Suzie? I guess there's always more privacy violations we could talk about if that's. Oh,
yeah, unfortunately, given that that's the mainstream, yeah.
Right, yeah. I just want to say, guys, you guys said that in the future we'll buy everything from Google. That's not true. We'll be buying everything from Amazon with money, but we'll be paying for stuff with Google from Google, not with money, but with data. So I guess
let's not do any of those. Let's build a different future.
Yeah, sorry. When I say we, I mean
I know.
But cool.
Hey, Blake.
Hey. So I've just got a couple of questions. I'm hoping to get some more.
It's early here in Europe, at least. Into Sunday.
Luke Waddington asked, have Silicon Valley and the tech giants morphed into being another branch of the government?
Well, I think Suzie and I kind of covered that a little bit. It's not necessarily that they're another branch of government, but they are definitely in some regards as powerful, if not more powerful than certain governments. They have more in common with governments than they do with you as an individual. We know that they collude. We know that they have in the past. We know that there are channels of communication there. We know that, Eric Schmidt leads a team at the Pentagon, an initiative at the Pentagon with Jeff Bezos, etc. So it seems to be a very intimate setting. And again, I'll just go back to, Bruce Schneier's quote on this, which I think is timeless, where he says, governments didn't just wake up and say, let's get all this data. They looked up and said, corporations have all this data. Let's get ourselves a copy. As long as we're creating these centralized silos of information and insight about everyone, then people are going to want access to that. And when the people that want access to that are governments that have the right to incarcerate you or deprive you of your life in certain countries, that's very dangerous.
For sure, yeah. And I mean, I agree. It's not that Google is the government per se, although they used to do almost no lobbying like 10 years ago. Like, we're engineers, we're going to build the best product, and like that's how we're going to win. And now they're like, wait a second, if we really want to take over the world, then like we can't have these like laws or regulations. If you call them laws, then breaking laws sounds bad. If you say regulation, at least in the US, that means that the government's trying to put its like powerful, greedy hands on you and force you to do something, and therefore regulation is bad in this totalitarian thing. So including privacy protections or consumer protections. Oh yeah, that's just that's overreaching. That's overbearing.
Oh yeah, I mean I was speaking earlier about when I spoke with Eric Schmidt at an event in London a few years back. And the other thing that really stood out from that conversation that I still remember is he said to me, I wake up every morning and I fight regulation. That's my job. That's what I do. So it's not like they're hiding it. So when you hear things like Suzie was mentioning earlier, self-regulation or its close cousin co-regulation, where we say, hey Google, come to the table, tell us, how should we regulate you on privacy? And they go, well, we have a couple ideas about that. My friend Jeff just prepared a presentation. So all of this is just institutional corruption. It's bullshit. We need to be regulating them as strongly as we can to limit their abuses, and we need to be funding and encouraging the decentralized, free and open, interoperable alternatives, the end-to-end encrypted alternatives.
Absolutely. I got an email, anyone with more than like 5 years of programming experience will get, of course, constant recruiter emails. So, emails reached out to me 14 times. After the 10th time, I was tired of them contacting me. And I sent this letter. I actually forgot how strongly worded it was. But at the end, I'm like, I will be opposing your oligopoly.
And that's excellent.
Of the many rather than the few, or something like that. I'm like, Yeah. Okay.
Did you make that public? I mean, you have right now, but did you make that public? Because, that's how we win. I don't know if you heard earlier when I was saying, Eric again told me this. He basically said, if we become too evil, we'll never find anyone to work for us. And he means the best of the best. And this is how we do that. We start winning this when they become socially unacceptable. Somebody sent me almost exactly the same thing on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. He's a security guy. He was headhunted by Google. He sent them a response saying, I'm not going to work for a surveillance capitalist. Here's a link to Aral's blog post about why. And I asked him, can you make this public? He was like, okay, I will. And, these are the steps where people have to realize, wait a minute, I have a personal responsibility. If I go and work at Google, I'm building this farming machinery that farms people. And I might get money from it, but in the future, I'm not going to get respect from it.
Yeah. So that's awesome. No, to answer your question, I haven't made it public. I was trying to, this was like 3 or 4 years ago. I'd be happy to do that. I initially,
That'd be awesome. You have right now, people know.
Right. But I know what you mean. Like some kind of bigger press release or the full, content of it. Yeah. And I try to be sort of constructive. It's like, hey, if you want to reform your ways, like here's some things that you could do that would make it palatable for people like me to work there, And I did mention these, CJDNS and these like decentralized things at the time. And of course I got no response. And then just a different recruiter came back a year or two later and was like, hey, do you want to work at Google? We have free. Oh, that's another thing. In the message, I'm like, yeah, of course you're like extracting everyone's personal information and kind of messing things up, but free massages. So I just mocked like this idea that I could be, that people can just be bought regardless of the negative impacts that they're having.
And you didn't get a response because they can't be reformed. This is not about them making mistakes or not knowing the right things, the right from wrong, etc. It's their core business model. And as far as they're concerned, there's no problem because it's hugely successful within the success criteria in surveillance capitalism. They have a lot of zeros at the end of their bank account. Their shareholders are happy. As far as they're concerned, the system is working exactly as it should. We have a problem with it because we care about human rights, because we care about democracy. They don't have a problem with it. And that's why we can't reform them as much as we would love to. We need to regulate them. We need to limit their abuses and we need to replace them. And we need to encourage those replacements because Google is a factory farm for human beings. It's never going to become an animal sanctuary.
Right. Well, I mean, as you just alluded to, I mean, I do think that if there was sufficient pressure, where they would feel it, right? Where, like you said, if they just can't hire, kind of reasonable people like that could be interesting. There's a point at which I was thinking about trying to play some sort of role like this in college. I didn't end up. Well, I thought of it after college. I was like, here's what I could do. Here, I should create this group called Badass Engineers Against War, BEAW, pronounced BIAW, which might be too silly. But I was like, I should go around to like, engineering classrooms or something and help people find great jobs that they really like that are not in like war profiteering or in these
exactly
in capitalism. So, then if you can kind of redirect resources away from like the ones having negative impact, it does seem like, there's plenty of, there's stuff we could do. And of course, kind of, I don't want to say like it or not, but like there's, they do have a lot of power. And if you can have like, even if it's a fairly small improvement in the kind of behavior of giant multinational, $700 billion, market cap corporations, then, the net effect of that, I think can be positive. And I mean, post Snowden, Apple's obviously realized, wait a second, Google makes all their money from search and they're trying to extract more data to optimize that. We make hundreds of dollars per device. We can talk shit about Google and legitimately and start to like encrypt more stuff. And I mean, there's some people I know who they're not super close to Apple, but they suspect that Apple's probably going to make iCloud like a zero knowledge system where all the data you put in there is encrypted. Then it'd be like encrypted Dropbox and you're not trusting these centralized entities, right. But you do get the kind of conveniences of, cloud computing or putting stuff in the cloud because you can access your data from your devices. So there's lots of stuff that would be awesome to kind of pressure them into doing, but only if we do it in the right way and only if we can kind of, work together powerfully to do so.
Well, exactly. And the difference between Google and Apple, exactly as you said, is Google makes its money by selling products, right? Like exactly as you said, when they sell an iPhone, they've made their profit. Tim Cook is happy. If you buy an iPhone and you throw it out the window, Tim Cook doesn't care. I mean, he'd probably like it if you bought some movies or subscribed to something as well, but that's how they make their money, by selling things. Whereas with Google, if you buy an Android phone and you throw it out the window, Google doesn't like you. They hate your guts because they only start making money when you start using the tool. Because again, that's not a tool for you. That's a factory farming tool for them to farm you with. So in this system, you can see how Apple was always a product company, and for them, privacy becomes an absolute competitive advantage. It's what they can compete on without breaking a sweat. It doesn't affect their bottom line, or affects it positively if we think of privacy as something that people want, which I believe it is. Whereas if Google really tried to compete on privacy, they would go bankrupt. If they actually stopped violating your privacy tomorrow, they would be bankrupt. So they couldn't even think that without being sued by their shareholders, of course. But we're talking about two completely different business models. So yeah, and still I would stress, and that's why we can't reform Google. I agree with you that if you get them to do things a little better because they're shamed into it, etc., and this is where regulation really comes in, or we force them to, then that will have, you know, positive impacts. But like you were saying earlier, we need those alternatives, the ethical alternatives, that people who care about these issues also have a place to go and work, you know, that they don't have to work at Google and Facebook.
Guys, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yep.
I can hear you, Susie.
Okay.
Should we take another question from Blake? What do you guys think?
I just had a quick question for you, actually.
Okay.
Just two things. First, on regulation.
There we go. Sorry, I was echoing back. Okay. This is going to be a pain.
That was my fault. There's two of you, and I saw one of them muted, and I unmuted the other.
I'm actually cheating, and I'm using audio on my mobile because I had an issue with my laptop. So maybe just turn my video off, please, on this profile so people don't get a black screen with Suze on it. Would be good.
I mean, I can see your video and it's lip synced correctly. So.
Okay, on my screen it's showing like a black screen with Suze written on it. But anyways, I'll just go ahead. So on the regulation front, my concern with this is that we had like the Microsoft antitrust suit that had Microsoft paying millions of dollars in fines, and they just paid them. Like if you remember, this was years back. They just said we would rather pay it than change our business model. And so there they were paying hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and just basically giving a middle finger to the court. So how do we get around that? And just my second question is about diversity of these systems, because right now the entire planet is using Google Android or iPhone predominantly. And it seems to me that people who create meaningful alternative platforms are either bought out or shut down. So either they will give you the money and to, you know, and co-opt your platform, or they will outright, you know, target you. And we've seen many technologists who've created new platforms being aggressively targeted by the state in order to prevent uptake of that new platform. So how do we avoid these two things? How do we avoid regulation just being ignored and the companies just paying the fines? And how do we develop new competing platforms without them being bought out or shut down by the state?
Well, very briefly, if I may take the both of them together, I guess, because they're related as well. So in terms of how do we prevent the shutdowns or being taken over? Now, I'm not sure about the state aspect of it, but even before we get there, we have this system of venture capital, which does that very nicely by sabotaging it from the very beginning. So you have a new so-called startup in the Silicon Valley parlance. They take venture capital. The venture capitalist invests in the exit of the business, the sale of the business, not the business itself. So they don't want a sustainable long-term business. They don't get any money back for that. They get their money back hopefully several times over when you sell either to a larger company like Google or Facebook, or you go public yourself with an initial public offering, an IPO. So this system, within the confines of the system, we can't fix this. Because if you are successful, then by definition, you get bought by Google or Facebook, or you become the next Google or Facebook. and your business model has to be compatible with Google and Facebook in order to be bought by them. So from the very beginning, we can't actually solve these issues. What was the first part of the question, actually?
About regulation, where Microsoft paid the fines.
Right, and we're seeing that right now in Europe. We're seeing that with Google getting fined a historic amount of money, but at the same time, in terms of their revenue, it's negligible, right? But we are seeing also hopeful developments like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that's coming in, which does impose quite hefty fees that might actually make a dent. But we're seeing a will to be able to make a dent, at least in Europe. I'm kind of seeing that. Whether that'll be effective, I don't know, because like we discussed before, the core problem is we're institutionally corrupt. We have a huge amount of influence through money, through lobbying, through revolving doors coming in from these corporations. So whether or not we can make leeway, I think our first target has to be that. We need to fight institutional corruption so we can regulate effectively. But at least in Europe, we're seeing people trying to push through things like GDPR, which mostly, as far as I understand, is the work of Paul Nemitz at the European Commission. He's one of the few people I've met there who, I actually respect because they're trying to do something positive. We have a fight coming up right now on the e-privacy regulation that's at the European Parliament. Keep your eyes on that, because that's going to be an attempt to water down some of the provisions that are in the e-privacy, that are in GDPR. So one of the key things to keep your eyes on is, I think it's called legitimate concern, where they're trying to use that idea of legitimate concern to allow ISPs to just, have all sorts of data and to use that data on you, and of course make it available to the state, etc. So keep your eyes on e-privacy regulation at the European Parliament, because that's going to require input from us in the next few days. But I think there's a lot to be hopeful for. We do live in a systemically unequal world. We do live in a world of institutional corruption. At its very core, if we're going to make any progress, we need to tackle that issue before anything else. Before we can regulate effectively, we need to remove the influence of corporate finance on public policy making. That's what I would say about it.
Blake, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a good chance to slip in a question, which was, if you're someone who uses encryption, does that make you like a red flag?
Well, here's the thing. Yeah, if public is the default, then anything you want to keep private has an association of guilt attached. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Sure. No, that's a great point. Yeah. So, I mean, we know from some NSA documents, thanks to Snowden, that that the NSA may keep a little bit closer track of people using Tor specifically, not encryption stuff in general. I don't believe, but definitely Tor. So one tangible piece of advice I can give to people is to help with this is to use a VPN for as far as like using Netflix from any country in the world, and for like very common business purposes. A lot of people use VPNs. So over a VPN, you could be doing whatever you want. You could be using Tor over a VPN. You could be sending whatever encrypted emails or whatever it is that you're doing, and that helps with that. But as Aral, I think, started alluding to, if we can make these tools sufficiently commonplace, then the idea that if 90% of people or whatever or more are just naturally using secure, not even alternatives, if just the normal stuff that people use is secure, then we can really flip the script on that. So I really so there's that. And then the other thing I tell people is like, are you really willing to say, what? I'm willing to go without human privacy. I'm going to give it all away because there's some tiny chance that like somebody is, keeping an eye on me. That means that you're giving your freedom away. That's the chilling effect of mass surveillance and having it known that this is going on is having that impact on you. So let's make these tools ubiquitous so that everything is just naturally encrypted. And create alternatives so that people use these things so they're easy to use, like Aral mentioned earlier, so that we actually do get adoption. There are people creating some tools that, but if they're not easy enough to use, then then they won't work, and that won't protect anybody. So let's make encryption ubiquitous. And next to WhatsApp and Signal and a couple others, that is slowly becoming the norm. But we need a lot more than just messaging to be encrypted. Right now, it's almost just messaging. With pursuance, the ability to like share files and documents and to do task management in a secure way without trusting the server you're collaborating through should be a big step.
I've got a couple of points.
You mentioned. Oh, sorry, Suzie.
Oh, sorry. I've got a couple of points to add to that because I've got a fair bit of personal experience. You're completely right about Tor users being targeted and us knowing that from the Snowden documents, Steve. So I'd say two things. First of all, it depends on where you are locationally and what the culture is around you. For example, when I was in Malaysia, having encrypted data packets going through the Wi-Fi there was like a screaming red flag. So when I'm surrounded by people who aren't sending encrypted data packets and I am sending encrypted data packets, then absolutely that to the local authorities is like, wow, big deal. This person's submitting encrypted data. Why are they doing this? One of the greatest achievements of Snowden, it's one of the ones that is the least talked about, is that more than half of the internet is now HTTPS by default. And he was a huge driver behind that. And HTTPS everywhere and initiatives like this are very, very important. So Steve is correct that it needs to become ubiquitous. We can provide protection to each other by all using encrypted data at all times and various methods of encryption. It's very, very, very important. But the other thing that you need to understand, and this is really key, is that, and we also know this from Snowden, is that even if you're not using encrypted platforms, you are a target because they are collecting everything from the pipes, literally from at pipe level, and the key infrastructure is all tapped into. So they are targeting everybody by default. So if they target you because you are using encrypted platforms, you are still targeted even if you don't. They will still collect your data. They can still run their queries on it. They can still decide that they want to focus on you for whatever reason, be it your race or your socioeconomic class or your political activism or whatever, or your associations. You can be targeted. So there's no point in not using encryption in case you get targeted when everybody is targeted by default. So when Snowden said collect it all, that they want to collect it, I mean, we've just been discussing in this very program about how all school students' data is going to be consumed by Google and preserved forevermore. All these kids are targets. All the adults are targets. Everybody in the Western world and probably most of the third world is a target already. So I would say, please, not only use encryption, but convince everybody else to as well, because that is our best chance at regaining some privacy.
Well, Suzie, you mentioned people, being targets because of it. We're seeing this in Turkey, where users of an app called Bylock, just because they were known to use that app, are being imprisoned. That's being used in Turkey as the sole requirement for guilt right now. And Steve, I just wanted to say, you mentioned VPNs. Now, of course, when you're using a VPN, the organization that you are vulnerable towards is the organization providing the VPN service. So you have a secure connection to their network, but they have visibility at that point. They can log, they can see what you're doing, et cetera, if they want to. Trusting that organization, it's required. It's not a perfect system. You need to trust the organization. Which VPN providers do you trust? Because I get this question a lot. And usually I was using a VPN called Cloak, which is now Encrypt Me because F-Secure bought them. But when it was Cloak, my friend Dave actually made it. So that's why I was using it, because I trusted Dave. And right now, because it's a larger company, I might actually, did F-Secure buy it? No, F-Secure didn't buy it. So I'm thinking about something else. Another company bought it. But now I'm thinking I'll probably use, Peter's VPN, iPredator, because I trust Peter Sunday. He's a friend of mine. So I'll use his VPN. But what do you use, just out of curiosity?
That's a great question. I've researched it a fair amount. I've been using NordVPN,
okay.
but I need to. There's some finer details related to kind of which countries different things are operating in that I would like to be more savvy with. I mean, I will say there's a website. What does he call himself? Like That VPN Guy or something like that, who did like the most insanely rigorous write-up where he has like 40 data points about like each VPN provider. Anyway, that looked very impressive. So, but I know people associated with, I think it's called CryptoStorm, something like that, VPN, and they say it's really good. Or people who are closer to the technical stuff tell me it really is done right, and that you can pay for it with cryptocurrencies. And the thing that they give you is just like a token. It's not like your email and your password. It's just like a randomly generated thing. Right. So apparently that's like less associated to your personal information than other things are, especially if you're using cryptocurrency, right? So like I pay with Bitcoin, I get this random hash or this token or whatever that I can like throw into VPN software and use that. So that sounded pretty promising. And a guy who works on that said he was a little bit, he said that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and that Proton Mail has like Proton VPN now, and that they have done a lot of stuff kind of copying CryptoStorm. I asked him if he was flattered by that. He seemed more bothered that the good ideas were going to like a better funded company or whatever. But so I'll look at Proton VPN and some of the extensive write-ups from like that VPN guy or something, and look at CryptoStorm more.
So just so you guys know, I just got a warning that my data allowance is about to run out as well. I'm on my cell phone here and I'm roaming. So again, if I disappear, I'm not being rude.
And you
Blake, do you have any more questions?
Yeah. Sorry, I've got to unmute myself twice because I'm live streaming to Facebook.
I love the radical contextualization that's going on here. We're talking about the medium as much as anything.
Someone wrote a fantastic article about the series of events where they were saying that we're the epitome of the hacktivist culture, with me like broadcasting from my bedroom. And like,
when is from Paul McGee? When is Pursuance Project open to the public?
So that's a great question. So as I mentioned, November 4th and 5th, we're going to do the first public demo of Pursuance. That's going to be big. And then, so we've been telling people by the end of this year, by the end of this calendar year, so sometime in December, we will start onboarding people into Pursuance. Now, the initial people to join will be kind of hand-selected. We want the initial groups to be people we trust, people that we think will kind of do things that we really, really want to see done in the world. Anti-spy bill is something that's very important. As Suzie has eloquently spoken of before, it would be really, really great if, we could kind of set this precedent in the West, in New Zealand, where you had much better privacy protections than exist now, and that it kind of spread that throughout the world. That would be awesome. So that is a very great example of the kind of thing that we want initial pursuances to be based around. Of course, because of Barrett's experience with prison and whatnot, like prison reform is something that could be is something that we're passionate about. Privacy, as I mentioned, like kind of whistleblower protections is another thing that we're looking at. So anyway, so we're going to have these kind of initial pursuances that we invite to the platform first, and have them as sort of beta testers, get some feedback from them, like get rid of some bugs, add some features, and we'll kind of slowly open the door kind of wider and wider, so to speak, and let more and more people in. So I'm not sure when someone will be able to come in fully to the public. Sometime in the first quarter of next year, so a few months from now. Between now and then, we'll have we're going to do a Kickstarter campaign to amplify our efforts and add these features that people really want. And we will be, letting in these kind of really exciting groups initially. Now that said, of course, so we are doing all of our development in the open. So if you go to github.com/pursuance project, you could take our code and install the Pursuance system on your server. It's not quite there yet in terms of being able to use it as sort of to try it out as far as kind of Pursuance proper. We have been building individual pieces and launching them as independent apps. So if anyone in the world goes to leapchat.org right now, leap, L-E-A-P, you will instantly be thrown into an end-to-end encrypted chat session in the browser. So yeah, so
very cool stuff. Very
thanks,
cool.
yeah.
And I'm super proud that we were sixth. I'd just like to say we were sixth in the world to be invited onto Pursuance. So Internet Party as a whole. So it was really cool, and we're really looking forward to it. I can also tell you that the top cream de la cream privacy activists in the world are involved in, and FOIA activists and many other types of activists are involved in this program. It is really the best of the best has come together.
It's a great point. Yeah. So Ray Johansson of Pirate Party International, in particular, has done an amazing job of just inviting. He knows thousands of activists. You're right, Suzie. It is dozens of the very best people. Lots of FOIA activists, people who care about privacy.
Oh, we just lost Aral.
Oh, bummer. Not the battery.
Yeah, I think his data just died. Blake, if you have other questions for Aral, you could actually just send me the list and I will send it to him privately. And then next week we will answer people's questions. Oh, he's back. Cool. Okay, let's do Aral first. So Blake, are there other questions for him?
Go for it.
I'm not sure.
You're muted, honey. Aral, you're muted.
Is Aral there? I don't see him. But okay, go ahead.
Is he?
You can unmute him. You, Blake. I'm pretty sure you can unmute
him. and then he went. Unmute. Where is he? Has he got his video?
We're back. Can you hear me now?
Well done.
I'm on Wi-Fi at the hotel, so this might be a worse connection, but at least it won't disconnect.
Awesome.
So the question was, how real are Google's serverships?
Service ships? What'd you say?
Serverships? I think it's like underwater data centers.
Haven't heard.
God.
So this is not the response on that one.
I've not heard about them either, but it sounds like a jurisdictional nightmare.
I mean, I will say that Google does have plenty of data centers that are near sort of water sources because one of the most expensive things about a data center is the cooling cost. So being able to just use kind of water for cooling is pretty popular. I don't know about like undersea layers or whatever you were just asking about, but there is water used for cooling. I know that much.
Server submarine sounds cool.
Google barges, they were called. I'm looking at Wikipedia, built between 2010 and 2012. I don't know, maybe that's something else. It looks like it's a showroom or a shop or something. I'm just reading the questions.
Okay, next. Sorry, guys, we don't know about Google serverships.
That's it for now.
Okay, cool. Okay, what questions do you guys want to ask each other? We'll wrap up in about 10-15 minutes, but I'm sure you must have questions for each other.
I don't know. I think we seem to have covered quite a wide gamut today. Touched upon quite a few things.
I would like to know what you were talking about at the event that you were at last night, which was titled Freedom Not Fair. That sounded really interesting. I saw that you had a keynote there.
Yeah, it was a lovely little event. A lot of activists from all around Europe. So it's funded by the European Parliament. It's actually funded by MEPs like Julia Reda from the Pirate Party. It's interesting how it's funded. So the activists are actually brought here and it's paid for so that they can meet with the MEPs. But they also have this event where they get together. So a lot of people from EDRI, people from a huge amount of people from Germany, of course, because there are lots of people who care about these issues. And it was just a really beautiful gathering. And it was nice to see the community that, the privacy community in Europe getting together. And yeah, the talk was really about the issues that we were talking about today. How can we build an internet of people? I mean, first of all, how do we make the problem and communicating the problem as accessible as possible, because that's an issue that, and you touched upon that, Suzie, that's very important, that we can articulate it. Because if you look at, for example, institutions like Singularity University, I don't know if you've heard of them, you know, they're not a university to begin with. They're the PR arm of Silicon Valley, but like they have a place in Denmark right now. And they have basically like a straight line to the Danish government, to the top of the government, and they have resources. So I was doing a keynote at a corporate event a little while back, and the person after me was from like Credit Suisse or something, and she did a presentation, and all of her slides had Singularity University at the bottom of them. So they're making their narrative as accessible as possible. They're making it very easy for people to like, I mean, just like literally they're putting slides out there that people can take and present their views of what technology should be like, the surveillance capitalism viewpoint. They're making it very easy. We need to do the same thing. So that was part of what I was talking about. We need to agree on certain terms and fundamentals. You know, I call myself a cyborg rights activist. That's not just to sound cool. It's because I really do feel that our relationship to modern technology, if we can frame it as a relationship of a cyborg to its organs, as in even if they're explants, not implants, then we can expand our understanding of the boundaries of the self beyond our biological boundaries to encompass the technologies by which we extend ourselves. And then existing human rights law would actually protect those new boundaries. So there are foundational aspects of this that we need to actually be able to communicate to each other as well, because we see our relationship today as, you know, master butler. I talk to my phone with Siri. I tell it to please note this thought that I had in your notes application. Siri says, yeah, sure, I'll do that. It's a conversation between two actors. And then with surveillance, oh, it's just signals capture between two actors having a conversation, what it's always been since the Stasi. But if we start seeing our relationship to technology differently, and we say, okay, no, actually, when I have a thought, and I place that thought on my phone and not just in my brain, I'm extending my mind, and thereby I'm extending myself using my phone. And then it would make sense to extend our understanding of the boundaries of the self to include these technologies. Well, then surveillance becomes something very different. It becomes an assault on the self. And we already have a system of laws and justice that knows how to deal with assaults on the self. So things like this, you know, how do we agree on certain basic definitions? And then what is the kind of world we want to create? The Internet of People, as I call it, where every person owns and controls their own place on the internet. And the bit that gives me hope about that, I'm in Brussels right now. I was in Ghent doing a keynote, the opening keynote for a Future of the City style conference, the first one they had. And Ghent is a very interesting place. It's very progressive. I heard that when they built the castle in the middle of Ghent back in the day, the fortifications, they didn't build those against outside invaders. They built them against the people of Ghent. So you get some idea about, you know, the kind of people that live there, which is kind of cool. So they reject, the city rejects the whole smart city thing from the idea from Silicon Valley. So they were thinking, how could we build a city of people, which is very compatible to what I want to see, which is an internet of people. And I saw that they have the .ghent top-level domain, which is very rare. They're one of the first cities that have their own top-level domain. And one of our biggest challenges with decentralized systems is how do we compete with the experience of centralized systems like Facebook? Because signing up to Facebook and getting an identifier from there is 30 seconds, right? You put in your name, you put in your email address, boom, Facebook says you can be Aral 1976 or something, right? How do we, to compete with that, in a decentralized system, how do I get, say, my own Mastodon instance in 30 seconds? Because I can't right now. I need to register a domain name. I need to get a server and hosting somewhere. I need to install it. I need to have all that technical knowledge. We're not talking 30 seconds. We're talking half a day if you're highly skilled, right? Orders of magnitude difference. This is the biggest design challenge we have right now. But Ghent has .ghent. So I turned my opening keynote into a proposal for the city. And I basically said, look, we can start the Internet of People. Here in Ghent, you have 250,000 people here. With a city of people, we give 250,000 people their own place on the internet. And we can have that be a system where they can talk to each other privately. They can talk to the city A car park, for example, might, let's think of it as 250 Mastodon instances, and car parks are tooting, right? They're saying we have 5 places free. People can talk to each other. Suddenly, we've started that internet of people with 250,000 instances in a decentralized system. I mean, how amazing would that be? And I got off the stage and I talked to their head of strategy. And I was like, so what do you think? And he was like, let's do it. So, we're talking. He's coming down to Brussels tomorrow. We're going to have another chat. We're trying to see how we can do this. But it's an amazing opportunity. And these are the things that give me hope, and that's the kind of stuff that we were talking about yesterday.
That's awesome. I have 2 specific proposals to help solve the usability challenges that you just mentioned. One of them is this really amazing technology that we are building into Pursuance called Minilock. Minilock lets you just type like a username and a passphrase that you memorize, and from that it generates a cryptographic key pair. So you just type in like username and password like you normally would, and suddenly you have this identity. So then people can encrypt things that only you can decrypt. And then of course, then you can encrypt things for other people that the intermediaries can't see. So that's something that I think is very interesting, where there's no central authority giving you this identifier. It's just your username and password generates this thing that is unique. So that's kind of interesting. And then when it comes to, like you said, how does someone kind of get this kind of independence, on the web, right? It's like either you use some centralized service, or you're really technical and then you spin up a server and you're a Linux systems administrator and you're running Ansible scripts and you're doing all this complicated stuff. So one thing that I've seen that we're considering doing with Pursuance is, wouldn't it be cool if someone said, hey, I want my own server running my own instance of Pursuance? And what if they could pay a few dollars to do that? And then we spin up a server for them. They totally own it. We don't control it afterward. So exactly. Those are kinds of things that I think could really make this more accessible to people.
Exactly. That's exactly the topology we need to. And we need to decentralize topologically, because we keep hearing about blockchain this, blockchain that, cryptocurrency. I'm sorry, I'm really not interested in your right libertarian get rich quick scheme and your upcoming ICO, right? Yes, blockchain decentralizes trust. If we have a contract, we don't trust each other, then we can have a distributed ledger that, and proof of work, etc., where we decentralize that trust. Great, valid use case, not the core of the decentralization that we need to effect. If we have a system with 1 billion people, we have to have that in 1 billion places. And that's the key thing we need to solve first. But yeah, I agree with you, Steve.
And blockchain cannot scale past a few million people. So that's a huge problem. You could never have something like a Mastodon that is at Twitter scale with blockchains right now. I mean, the creator of Ethereum gave a talk the other day, and he's like, well, we're doing 5 transactions a second on the Ethereum blockchain. And once we get to 6, we'll be maxed out. We won't be able to do any more. Are you kidding me? This is it's not good for running apps on top of. So that's why we're not.
What's frustrating for me is, though, because of the potential, again, for a huge amount of money to be made, it's the only thing anyone's talking about, right?
I know.
And it's taking attention away from the actual core issues.
Absolutely. So a year ago, when I was trying to figure out where's the best place in the world that I should live to work on privacy enhancing software, and I went to meetup.com, and so I ended up moving to San Francisco, and it's been awesome. But it's okay. So I looked up crypto. I looked up which is short for encryption, of course. People think crypto is short for cryptocurrency. It's insane. So I agree. They're totally hijacking the energy. So it is people working on stuff that doesn't make much sense, and now you have literally over 1,000 cryptocurrencies, so they're not really unique between each other anymore for the most part. So it's a huge problem. So I was looking around, and it's okay, 80% of people talking about crypto are talking about Ethereum, 10% or 15% are Bitcoin, and 5% are, hey, maybe we need privacy in the 21st century using encryption now that all of our lives are flowing through the internet every day. Oh yeah, you think that would be nice. Let's make it happen.
Exactly.
Okay, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. I just want to say there is a huge crisis of hope in the activism movement at the moment that you guys are actually okay. But that's it. Come here. Come on. Come
Hello.
on, you may as well be viewed with other people. Come on. I don't know why you have Katarina's scarf on. Come sit with me, okay? Because I'm just concluding now.
That is a lovely scarf.
He's got his sister's scarf on for unknown reason. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is there has been a huge crisis of hope in the activism movement at the moment. And I've actually been saying to people, what are solutions? We need solutions and not just problems. This is our New Zealand flag stocking. And you guys are both sitting here developing, working on, and talking about solutions. And we really, really needed that. So I wanted to say thank you so, so much for that and for bringing us some hope, because we did really, really need it. Okay, I'm going to go be a mum now.
Thank you so much. Yes, you do that, but thank you so much for having us. It's been a delightful conversation.
Amazing.
And everything you said, right back at you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. This is awesome. We'll talk again soon.
You guys are awesome. Hashtag anti-spy bill. It's
Thank you. Thank you. We'll be back next Sunday with more stuff. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye, Blake.
Thanks, Blake.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, Aral. Nice talking to you.
Likewise.